Blood tastes like old pennies. Burning console wiring smells like cheap plastic. Put them together in a pressurized cabin, and it smells like a waiting grave. We were losing. The alien armada hadn't just beaten us. They'd calculated our deaths to the decimal. Then the gravity klaxon screamed. Elias spat a mouthful of copper-tasting saliva onto the grated deck. The vibrations of the cruiser Corsica were wrong. Usually a starship hummed. A steady, barely perceptible thrum of the reactor-driving life support, artificial gravity and sublight engines. It was a feeling of safety, of mass holding back the vacuum. Now she shuddered. Like a dying dog shivering on cold asphalt, he wiped his mouth with the back of a grease-stained glove. His hand was trembling. He hated that. He was 34 years old, a seasoned sensor technician, a father of 2, and his hand was shaking like a frightened child's. He shoved it deep into the pocket of his flight suit, hoping Harlan hadn't noticed. "Report," Captain Harlan barked, his voice cracking. Harlan didn't look like a captain anymore. His uniform was unzipped at the collar, soaked in cold sweat, and a superficial gash above his left eyebrow leaked a steady thin line of red down his cheek. Elias leaned over the tactical console. The screen was cracked down the middle, distorting the holographic projection of the battle space, but the telemetry was clear enough. It was a massacre. "Coalition left flank is gone, sir," Elias said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. The Bismarck and the Agamemnon just went dark. Reactor signatures flatlined. No escape pods on the sweep. Harlan didn't curse. He didn't slam his fist against the bulkhead. He just closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. "And the hostiles?" "Repositioning," Elias answered, watching the red blips on his screen. "Vectoring to enfilade our center. They aren't even rushing." That was the worst part. The Vora didn't fight with passion, anger, or desperation. To them, war was a solved equation. Their ships were perfectly symmetrical, smooth, teardrop-shaped vessels of polished white alloy that looked more like modern art sculptures than machines of death. They moved in flawless geometric formations. When they fired, it wasn't a barrage of chaotic artillery. It was a single, precisely calculated beam of ultraviolet energy that bypassed kinetic shields and boiled a ship's crew from the inside out before detonating the reactor. Clean, efficient, mathematical. They had studied the Coalition's tactics for a decade before making first contact. They knew exactly how fast a standard cruiser could turn, exactly how much heat a deflector shield could dissipate, exactly how human and allied alien commanders reacted under pressure. They had plotted this battle before the first shot was fired. A low groan reverberated through the Corsica's hull. The temperature in the Combat Information Center was dropping rapidly. Elias could see his own breath puffing in the dim, flickering emergency lighting. The primary environmental scrubbers had failed 20 minutes ago. The air was getting thick, heavy with the stench of ozone, charred insulation, and the sour, sharp smell of terrified people. "Divert auxiliary power to the port deflectors," Harlan ordered, staring at the main viewer. "Keep our bow facing their dreadnought." "Sir, if we pull from auxiliary, we lose the medical bay's stasis pods," Lieutenant Cole said from the engineering station. Cole was barely 20, his face pale and drawn. "If we don't hold those deflectors, we lose the whole damn ship, Cole. Do it." Elias watched Cole's fingers hesitate over the keypad. A brief, agonizing moral calculus. Then, the keystrokes. The deck vibrated slightly as power was shunted through the dying conduits. Elias felt a sickness in his stomach. He didn't want to die, but looking at the tactical feed, seeing the inescapable net the Vora were drawing around the remaining 12 ships of the Coalition fleet, a traitorous part of his mind wished it would just be over. The waiting was exhausting. The adrenaline had burned out hours ago, leaving behind a hollow, aching fatigue. His eyes stung. His boots felt filled with lead. On the main viewer, the blackness of space was scored by the silent, brilliant flashes of dying ships. The Vora formations adjusted. 3 teardrop cruisers drifted elegantly through the wreckage of the Agamemnon, their hulls completely unblemished. "They're locking targeting lasers on our center mass," Elias reported, his throat dry. Estimate 40 seconds to primary weapon discharge. All remaining batteries fire at will, Harlan said quietly. It wasn't an order to fight. It was a refusal to die quietly. The Corsica shuddered violently as her forward plasma cannons discharged. On the screen, the bolts of superheated gas crossed the void. They splashed harmlessly against the Vora's phase shields, dissipating into bright, useless ripples of light. The Vora didn't even break formation. They just absorbed the impact and continued their slow, methodical advance. Elias gripped the edge of his console. The metal was freezing. He thought of his apartment back on New Terra, the smell of coffee in the morning, the sound of rain against the cheap glass windows. It felt like another lifetime. Like a movie he had watched a long time ago. 30 seconds, Elias said. Yes. The Vor ships began to glow. A deep, sickly violet light emanated from their prows, gathering in intensity. The air in the CIC crackled with static. The hair on Elias's arm stood up. This was it. The end of the equation. "It's been an honor, Captain," Cole whispered. Harlan just nodded, keeping his eyes locked on the screen. 15 seconds, Elias muttered. He closed his eyes. He didn't want to see the flash. Then the deck lurched. It wasn't a weapon impact. It was a massive, concussive wave of gravitational displacement. The klaxons, previously silent, suddenly erupted in a deafening rhythmic shrieking. Elias's eyes snapped open. His console was going crazy. The telemetry was flooded with interference, a chaotic mess of radiation warnings, gravity spikes, and sheer white noise. His eardrums popped painfully. His teeth ached. A low-frequency hum, deep enough to rattle his ribs, tore through the ship. "Report!" Harlan yelled over the alarms. I don't know," Elias stammered, his fingers flying across the keys trying to filter the data. Massive spatial rupture, dead ahead, right in the middle of the Vora formation. A jump? Who's jumping directly into a gravity well? Nobody. It's suicide. The sheer forces alone. Elias trailed off. The static on his screen cleared for a fraction of a second. The mass reading was impossible. Captain, whatever it is, it's huge. Through the main viewer, the starfield distorted. Space itself seemed to bulge and tear, glowing with a dirty, furious orange light. The clean, elegant lines of the Vora fleet were thrown into disarray as the gravitational shockwave hit them. Two of their pristine cruisers were slammed against each other, their phase shields sparking wildly as they tried to compensate for the sudden, violent anomaly. The tear in space widened, bleeding Cherenkov radiation. And then it came through. It did not glide out of slip space. It tore its way in, dragging a wake of exotic particles and displaced dark matter. Elias stared at the main viewer, forgetting to breathe. It was a nightmare of engineering. Where the Vora ships were smooth, symmetrical and white, this thing was a jagged, asymmetrical slab of dark, scarred metal. It looked less like a starship and more like an industrial mining facility, strapped to a series of oversized thrusters. It was blocky, brutally utilitarian and massive. It dwarfed the Vora dreadnought. Thick plates of ablative armor overlapped like the scales of a diseased reptile, scored with the deep carbon-black burns of 100 previous battles. Massive, ugly cooling towers vented plumes of freezing gas into the vacuum. Along its flanks, protruding like broken ribs, were batteries of physical gun turrets, not energy emitters, barrels, massive, archaic barrels of dense alloy. "Identification," Harlan demanded, his voice hushed with awe and confusion. Elias swallowed hard, his throat clicking. He ran the transponder codes through the database. The computer chewed on the static for a moment before spitting out a heavily encrypted, archaic string of data. It's human, sir, but not coalition. It's carrying old United Nations Space Command codes. Very old. UNSC? They were decommissioned 50 years ago. They folded into the coalition. "I know, sir, but the registry reads..." Elias squinted at the flickering text. "UNS Trench, Super Dreadnought Class." The trench sat dead in the water for a long, agonizing moment. It looked dead. No running lights, no elegant glowing nacelles, just a monolithic block of iron and titanium, bleeding heat into the void. The Vora, recovering from the gravitational shockwave, quickly realigned. Their algorithms adapted. A new variable had been introduced into the equation, but it was just a machine. It could be calculated. It could be destroyed. 5 Vora cruisers broke off from the encirclement of the Coalition fleet and formed a spearhead, pointing directly at the massive dark intruder. The violet glow at their prows intensified. Elias watched the tactical feed. Vora vessels locking onto the trench. Energy spikes detected. "Can you hail them?" Harlan asked. "Tell them to get out of there. They're a sitting duck." Elias opened the comms channel. "UNS Trench, this is the Coalition cruiser Corsica. You're in the direct line of fire. Evasive action recommended. I repeat, evasive action." Static hissed back through the speakers. A harsh grating sound like grinding metal. Then, a voice. It wasn't the crisp, polished tone of a military officer. It sounded tired, gravelly, and profoundly annoyed. "Corsica, this is the Trench. Mind your own damn business and keep your heads down. We're working." The channel cut out. On the viewer, the 5 Vora cruisers fired. 5 perfect concentrated beams of ultraviolet destruction struck the trench simultaneously. Elias braced himself for the explosion. He knew what those beams did. He had watched them slice through the Agamemnon's layered energy shields and vaporize its hull in seconds. The beams hit the broadside of the trench. There were no energy shields, no rippling force fields to dissipate the heat. The Vora weapons struck the bare metal of the human dreadnought. The dark grey armour instantly flared white-hot. Metal boiled. Massive slabs of ablative plating blistered, liquefied, and blew outward into space in a chaotic spray of molten slag. The ship shuddered under the sheer kinetic force of the energy transfer. For a moment, Elias thought they had been cut in half. The beams ceased. The Vora ships held their position, waiting for the inevitable reactor breach. The trench was glowing cherry red along its entire port side. Entire sections of its outer hull were gone, revealing the jagged, ugly structural girders beneath. It looked mortally wounded, but the telemetry on Elias's screen told a different story. "Reactor signature is stable," Elias whispered, not quite believing his own instruments. They just took it. They just absorbed the heat." Harlan leaned closer to the screen. "Armour. Layers and layers of stupid, heavy, dense armour. No shields, just mass." The Vora vessel seemed to pause. It was a microscopic hesitation, but Elias noticed it. Their algorithms didn't account for a ship designed simply to get punched in the face and survive. Then the trench woke up. It didn't power up with a soft hum. It violently shuddered to life. Vents along its spine blew out massive clouds of white vapour. The massive gun turrets along its flanks, dozens of them, began to turn. It wasn't a synchronized movement. The turrets rotated individually, grinding against their mounts, locking into position with heavy mechanical finality. "Energy spikes on the trench," Elias yelled. "But it's not plasma, it's electromagnetic. Massive capacitor draws." "Railguns," Harlan realized, his eyes widening. "They're using kinetic artillery." The Vora, calculating the threat, attempted to maneuver, but they were too close. They had advanced, expecting a clean kill. The trench fired. There were no bright flashes of laser light, no elegant beams. There was only the brutal, silent recoil of 100 massive physical slugs being magnetically accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. The recoil physically pushed the massive dreadnought sideways. The exhaust from the barrels formed a dirty grey cloud of expanding gas and vaporized coolant. The Vora phase shields were designed to deflect energy, to dissipate heat and refract lasers. They were not designed to stop 2-ton blocks of depleted uranium moving at Mach 300. The kinetic rounds hit the Vora cruisers. It was a slaughter. the first cruiser simply evaporated into a cloud of shattered alloy and expanding atmosphere. The kinetic energy transfer was so violent that the ship didn't even have time to explode. It was pulverized into shrapnel. The second cruiser took a round through its central axis. The teardrop shape was violently ripped in half, spilling glowing blue fluid and the shattered bodies of its crew into the vacuum. The remaining 3 Vora ships scattered, their perfect geometry shattered by panic. Elias stood frozen. The air in the Corsica's CIC suddenly felt very cold, very still. He had spent years fighting a clean, surgical, hopeless war against an enemy that treated battle as mathematics. He was watching something entirely different. He was watching a bar brawl. The trench didn't wait to see the results of its first volley. It was already firing again. Not targeting individual ships, but filling the space with thousands of smaller secondary munitions. Flak. Proximity mines. Ugly, dirty, indiscriminate shrapnel. The masters of war didn't know what to do with chaos. The combat space, previously a stark, clean expanse of black void and elegant light, became a landfill. Elias coughed. The sharp tang of electrical fire in the CIC momentarily overridden by the sheer shock of what he was witnessing. The telemetry feeds were choking on the data. The trench wasn't just fighting, it was polluting the battlefield. Sensors are blinding, Elias warned, his fingers dancing across the ruined console trying to isolate friend from foe. Too much debris. The trench is ejecting mass every time it fires. Casings, sabots, coolant vapor. It's creating its own nebula. Keep a lock on the Vora dreadnought, Harlan ordered, his voice suddenly sharp, the fatigue completely erased by the adrenaline spike of unexpected survival. What are they doing? The Vora flagship, a massive, flawless oval of white composite, hung at the edge of the debris field. For the first time in the entire campaign, it was retreating. Its thrusters flared, attempting to pull back and reassess the chaotic variable that had just shredded its vanguard. They're backing off, trying to re-establish a firing line outside the shrapnel cloud, Elias reported. Smart, Harlan muttered. If they get range, they can pick that human brick apart. Armor only lasts so long. The commander of the trench clearly knew that too. The massive, ugly dreadnought didn't sit in its protective cloud of debris. Its main aft thrusters, 4 colossal circular vents that looked like the engines of a bygone chemical rocket era, ignited. The flare was a blinding, dirty yellow. The trench surged forward. It didn't maneuver with grace. It lumbered, brute forcing its way through the wreckage of the destroyed Vora cruisers, violently swatting aside chunks of white alloy with its own armoured prow. Sir, the trench is accelerating. It's on a collision course with the Vora dreadnought. It's going to ram them? Cole asked, his voice cracking. That's insane. It's not going to ram, Harlan said. His eyes narrowed, reading the trajectory on the main viewer. It's closing the gap. It's forcing a knife fight. The Vora dreadnought opened fire, not with a single beam, but with a dozen rapid-fire pulse lasers, trying to peel away the trench's armour before it could get within point-blank range. The human ship took the hits. Sparks and molten metal sprayed out like blood from a dozen wounds. The ship was visibly disintegrating on its outer layers. Entire sensor masts were sheared off. A secondary gun battery took a direct hit and detonated in a dirty orange fireball, the blast contained by the ship's massive structural bulkheads. Elias watched the telemetry of the trench with morbid fascination. It was a ship built on the assumption that it would be shot to pieces, redundancies upon redundancies. When a conduit severed, physical blast doors slammed shut, isolating the damage, and secondary lines mechanically engaged. It was an aesthetic of pure, stubborn survival. The Vora were aiming for critical systems, reactors, life support, command decks. But the trench didn't have a centralized bridge sticking out like a target. Its command center was buried deep in the heart of the ship, under meters of lead and iron. Distance to Vora flagship, 4,000 kilometers, Elias read out. 3,000, they're point blank. The trench stopped firing its railguns. The massive power draw needed to accelerate the slugs was suddenly shunted elsewhere. "Energy spike," Elias yelled. "Massive, but it's not the railguns." Along the prow of the human dreadnought, heavy armoured shutters retracted. Not weapons, bays, missiles, hundreds of them. They didn't launch with the sleek, guided precision of modern torpedoes. They erupted from the tubes in a chaotic swarm, burning solid chemical propellant that left thick, blinding trails of white smoke. They were dumbfire, unguided, heavy-yield nuclear warheads, a weapon banned by the Coalition for a century because of the radioactive mess they left behind. The Vora Dreadnought's point defense systems activated. Pinpoint lasers began picking the missiles out of the void, detonating them mid-flight. But there were simply too many. The trench wasn't trying to outsmart the point defense, it was suffocating it with volume. The void lit up in a series of blinding silent suns. Elias threw his arm over his eyes as the glare overwhelmed the viewing screens. The sensors shrieked in protest, the radiation warnings maxing out the dials. When the glare finally faded, leaving ghost images burning on Elias's retinas, he looked back at the screen. The Vora Dreadnought was severely damaged. The perfect white oval was scorched black. The nuclear detonations had overwhelmed its phase shields, and the sheer heat had cracked its composite hull. It was leaking atmosphere in 3 places, a visible mist of frozen vapour trailing behind it, but it was still alive, and its main weapon was glowing with a terrifying deep violet intensity, aimed squarely at the trench, which was now coasting through the fading nuclear fire, its own armour boiling and heavily degraded. "They're going to trade kill shots," Harlan said, his breath hitching. "No," Elias said, staring at a new, small blip on his sensor screen. It was small, too small to be a ship. "Captain, the trench didn't just fire missiles. Mixed in with the chaotic swarm of nuclear warheads, hidden by the blinding smoke and radiation, were boarding pods. Heavy, thick-hulled breaching torpedoes designed to survive the blast wave of their own ordnance. They had slammed into the fractured hull of the Vora Dreadnought while its shields were down. "Breaching pods attached," Elias confirmed, a cold sweat breaking out on his neck. "I'm reading atmospheric pressure changes inside the Vora ship. They've punched through." Harlan slowly lowered himself into his command chair, the tension leaking out of him in a long, shaky exhale. Marines, the battle in space essentially stopped. The Vora Dreadnought's main weapon powered down, its thrusters cut out. It drifted, dead in the water. The flawless equation of their warfare couldn't compute what was happening inside their own bulkheads. They had designed their ships to be operated by a skeleton crew of technicians overseeing automated systems. They had never planned for close-quarters combat. They had never considered the possibility of dirty, angry humans armed with shotguns and kinetic rifles blowing the hinges off their immaculate blast doors. Elias watched the life signs on the Vora ship begin to wink out. It wasn't a clean surgical process. It was messy. It was brutal. It was deeply, inherently human. For years, the Coalition had tried to elevate themselves to match the Vora, to fight a clean technological war, to be better, smarter, more precise. The trench was proof that humanity's true mastery of war wasn't in perfecting it. It was in embracing the ugly, raw, bleeding reality of it. They didn't win by solving the equation. They won by smashing the blackboard. Elias leaned back in his chair. His hands had stopped shaking. The Corsica still smelled like a tomb. The air was still cold, and his head still throbbed. But as he looked at the massive, scarred, beautiful monstrosity of the trench, drifting silently amidst the wreckage of the perfect alien fleet, he realized he wasn't going to die today. "Captain," Elias said softly, his voice finally steady, "hostile fleet is neutralized. We have the space." Harlan nodded slowly, staring at the debris field. "Hail them again, Elias. Let's see if they're in a better mood." Static hissed through the CIC, thick and rhythmic like the breathing of a dying man. Elias adjusted the dials on his ruined console, his fingers slipping on the plastic. His hands were covered in a thin, greasy film of sweat and condensed coolant. The silence from the trench was heavier than the gunfire had been. Beside him, Cole was quietly weeping, his head buried in his arms over the engineering station. Elias didn't comfort him. He barely had the energy to keep his own eyes open. "Keep hailing," Harlan said. The captain had sunk back into his chair, staring at the main viewer. The Vora dreadnought drifted in the centre of the debris field, a massive, scorched tombstone. Elias flipped a sequence of physical toggles, bypassing the damaged digital interface to access the unencrypted shortwave frequency bands. If the boarding pods had punched through, the Marines inside would be using local comms. Hardline, line-of-sight radio, ancient tech that couldn't be easily jammed by Vora phase interference. He found a signal. It wasn't a voice at first. It was a sound that made Elias's stomach clench. A wet, tearing noise followed by the deafening percussive roar of a localized explosion. Elias routed the audio through the CIC's overhead speakers. The sterile, freezing air of the Corsica was suddenly filled with the chaotic, horrifying sounds of close-quarter slaughter. Breachpoint Alpha secure, moving to intersection grid 4. Watch your corners, these pale bastards are crawling on the ceiling. The voice was distorted, oxygen-rich, filtering through a heavy rebreather mask. It didn't sound like a soldier giving a tactical report. It sounded like a butcher calling out an order in a slaughterhouse. "Contact front. Energy spike. Left corridor." There was a screech of alien electronics, a high-pitched whine that made Elias wince, followed immediately by a sound he hadn't heard outside of historical archives. It was the heavy mechanical clack-clack of a pump-action mechanism, followed by a thunderous boom that clipped the audio receivers. Someone on the feed laughed. It was a jagged, breathless sound. "Buckshot eats phase shields for breakfast. Keep moving. Push them back to the reactor core." Harlan stood up slowly. He looked sick. "Mute it, Elias." "Sir." "I said mute it," Harlan snapped, his voice trembling. "They aren't fighting a war in there. They're clearing a pest infestation." Elias reached for the dial, but his hand hovered over it. He was mesmerized. For 3 years he had watched his friends die to silent beams of light. He had watched ships vaporize into clean, mathematical clouds of atoms. The Vora had never screamed. They'd never bled. They had simply existed as a superior, untouchable equation. Hearing them die, hearing the wet, heavy thuds of kinetic slugs tearing through their immaculate composite armor and the fragile bodies beneath, triggered something dark and primal in the back of his brain. It was awful. It was barbaric. It was justice. Elias turned the volume down but didn't mute it. The crackle of small arms fire and the heavy rhythmic thumping of magnetic boots on alien metal served as a grim soundtrack to the graveyard outside their window. "Captain, the Vora Dreadnought's secondary power grid just went offline," Cole reported, his voice shaky, having finally lifted his head. "Life support on their command deck is venting." "They're suffocating them," Harlan whispered. 20 minutes passed. The longest 20 minutes of Elias's life. The Corsica groaned, her bulkhead shifting as the temperature continued to drop. They were bleeding out structurally. If a rescue tug didn't arrive from the Coalition rally point soon, surviving the battle wouldn't matter. Then, the static on the primary comms channel broke. "Corsica, this is the UNS Trench." The gravelly voice from before. It sounded even more tired now, accompanied by the distinct sound of a heavy metal hatch sealing shut in the background. Harlan straightened his uniform collar out of pure ingrained reflex. "Trench, this is Captain Harlan. We owe you our lives. Your intervention was not expected." A harsh, hacking cough echoed over the channel. "Yeah, well, don't write us a poem just yet, Captain. Your port engine block is leaking plasma like a stuck pig, and your environmental scrubbers are dead. You've got maybe 2 hours of breathable air left." "We're aware of our structural damage," Harlan said stiffly. "Can your medical bays accommodate our wounded?" "We have 42 critical. Send them over in the shuttles. We've got room, but warn them it smells like diesel and stale sweat over here. We don't have those fancy bio beds your Coalition ships use. Just bandages, morphine, and a lot of duct tape." "Understood," Harlan said. He hesitated, looking at the dead Vora dreadnought on the screen. And the hostiles? Are they neutralized? There was a long pause on the line. Elias heard the clinking of glass, liquid pouring. The math club? Yeah, they're done. Turns out when you punch a hole in their fancy white walls and introduce them to zero gravity and high velocity lead, their algorithms don't know what to do. They broke, Harlan. They panicked like anyone else. Who are you people? Elias blurted out, unable to stop himself. He violated every protocol of comms discipline, but the question was burning a hole in his chest. The UNSC was disbanded. The trench was officially scrapped 50 years ago. I saw the logs. Logs can be forged, kid, the voice replied, a grim amusement colouring the fatigue. Open a visual link. Let's look each other in the eye. Elias routed the handshake protocol. The cracked main viewer flickered, the image of the debris field wiping away to reveal the bridge of the human dreadnought. The screen didn't show a sweeping, elevated command tier bathed in soft blue holographic light. It showed a bunker. The walls were exposed, thick slabs of raw iron, bolted together with rivets the size of a man's fist. Thick bundles of insulated wiring hung from the ceiling in haphazard loops. The lighting was a harsh, industrial yellow, casting deep, ugly shadows across the faces of the crew. Smoke hung in the air, actual physical smoke from burned-out consoles and cheap cigars. Sitting in the centre, strapped into a battered leather seat bolted directly to the deck plating, was a man who looked like he had been dragged behind a rover. He was in his late 60s, maybe older. His grey hair was cropped brutally close to his scalp. A jagged, angry burn scar ran from his jawline down into the collar of his faded, oil-stained jumpsuits. He was holding a metal flask, unscrewing the cap with one hand while the other rested on a heavy physical throttle stick. "Commander Hayes," the man said, taking a swig from the flask. He didn't salute. He didn't even sit up straight. He just stared at the camera with eyes that looked like flat grey stones. Acting captain of this floating scrap heap. Harlan looked entirely out of his depth. He was a coalition officer, trained in diplomacy, multi-species integration, and elegant energy-based fleet maneuvers. He was looking at a ghost from humanity's violent, unrefined past. "Commander Hayes, I don't understand," Harlan said. "If the Coalition knew we had a dreadnought of this class still operational, it would have been deployed months ago. We've lost billions of lives to the Vora." Hayes let out a slow, rattling breath. He capped the flask. The Coalition didn't know. That was the whole damn point. 50 years ago, when the politicians signed the treaties and decided we were going to be enlightened citizens of the galaxy, they ordered the old dreadnoughts broken down. Said they were barbaric. Said relying on heavy armor and kinetic artillery sent the wrong message to our new alien friends. Hayes leaned forward, the yellow light catching the deep lines in his face. But a few of the old admirals, the ones who remembered what it took to claw our way out of our own solar system, they knew better. They knew that eventually you run into something in the dark that doesn't want to talk, something that doesn't care about your elegant shields or your diplomatic treaties. "A fail-safe," Elias murmured, staring at the screen. "Exactly, kid." Hayes pointed a thick, calloused finger at the camera. The trench wasn't scrapped. She was mothballed, hidden in a hollowed-out asteroid in the Oort cloud, skeleton crewed by generations of volunteers who didn't buy into the Coalition's fantasy that the universe is a safe, polite place. Hayes gestured vaguely to the bulkheads around him. "We watched the war on the deep space telemetry feeds. We watched the Vora pick your clean, beautiful ships apart. We analysed their tactics. They fight like a computer program. If A, then B. If shield strength is X, apply Y amount of thermal energy." The old commander smiled. It was a terrifying expression. It held no warmth, only a grim, predatory satisfaction. So we gave them a variable they couldn't compute. We gave them mass, and we gave them mud. We let them shoot us because this ship was built on the assumption that it was going to take a beating. We don't have shields to collapse, we just have more metal. Hayes tapped the armrest of his chair. The Vora believed they had mastered war because they sanitized it. They turned it into an equation. But war isn't math, Captain Harlan. Harlan stared at the screen, silent. War is a meat grinder, Hayes continued softly, the fatigue finally catching up to his voice. It's ugly. It's cruel. It's about who is willing to get closer, who is willing to bleed more, and who is willing to do the horrifying, barbaric things necessary to ensure they are the ones walking away when the dust settles. Hayes leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. The Vora thought they were the apex of military evolution. They forgot that humanity didn't evolve by being perfect. We evolved by surviving the Ice Age, the plagues, and each other. We are the masters of the mud. Elias looked away from the screen, turning his gaze back to the cracked tactical display. The sensor blips of the Vora fleet were entirely gone. The only things left were the expanding clouds of debris and the massive looming shadow of the trench. The smell of old pennies and burning plastic in the Corsica hadn't faded, but the suffocating terror that had gripped Elias for the past 4 hours was gone. In its place was a hollow, heavy exhaustion and a profound, disturbing realization. He had spent his whole life looking up at the stars, believing humanity was moving towards something brighter, something cleaner. But out here, in the cold, unforgiving vacuum of space, salvation hadn't come from the light. It had come from the dark. It had come from a rusted, brutal machine fueled by human stubbornness and an endless capacity for violence. "Shuttles are prepping for launch, Commander," Harlan finally said, his voice quiet, devoid of its usual authority. "We will begin transferring the wounded." "Copy that, Corsica," Hayes said. "My engineers are routing power to a tow cable. We'll drag your ass back to the rally point. It won't be a smooth ride." "We don't need smooth, Commander. We just need to go home." The visual link cut out, leaving the CIC bathed in the flickering emergency lights once more. Elias slumped over his console. He rubbed his eyes, feeling the grit and dried sweat on his face. He listened to the distant rhythmic clanking of the Corsica's docking bays opening to receive the heavy, ugly shuttles from the trench. He thought of his apartment on New Terra, the smell of coffee, the sound of rain. He wondered if he would ever be able to look at his clean, perfectly ordered life the same way again. He had seen the truth of the universe today. It wasn't a symphony of light and progress. It was a bar brawl in the dark, and thank God humanity knew how to throw a punch. If you enjoyed this grim, grounded dive into humanity's brutal survival against the Vora, hit that like button to feed the algorithm. It helps stories like this reach more sci-fi fans. Share this video with anyone who loves a gritty, realistic HFY tale, where humanity doesn't win with magic, but with sheer, stubborn grit. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next sci-fi adventure. Let me know your favourite moment in the comments below.